Hi, I'm Kate Christensen with 350 Colorado, and we're here today to talk to Milliken Biven. She is an expert on oil and gas financial assurances. She wrote federal legislation. She has been doing this work for a very long time. She um, conducted research policy and wrote the recommendations for financial assurance at Orphan wells that helped lead to the establishment of the Gulf of Mexico Renewable Offshore Energy Leasing Program. She wrote the federal legislation, the Abandoned Well Act of 2021. And she has a lot of personal experience that resonates with Colorado families. Growing up in Louisiana, she was right in Cancer Alley between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, where she also had the experience that a lot of Colorado families do of having a kid with asthma and having family members with cancer, all the industry diseases. So we really appreciate your time, Megan, talking with us about what's happening in Colorado right now.
What's happening with Colorado right now?
What's happening in Colorado right now is financial assurances are happening in Colorado right now. The Colorado Oil and Gas Commission is looking at how the financial assurances work for oil and gas wells. Do we have enough money to cover these oil and gas wells when we stop using them? And if we don't, how are we going to get that money is what we're trying to figure out right now. And that sounds like a simple question, but it's super confusing. And since you wrote the federal legislation about this and have a ton of experience looking at the policy, I was wondering if you could help us understand it a little bit better.
Sure. Let's get into the weeds, y'all. Well, thank you for having me first and foremost. I don't know how you're going to
Thank
edit
you for
this or
joining us.
whatever. But basically, I think for everyone who's tuning in or however you're going to edit this, to understand is that oil and gas operations happen across the United States. They happen on a state level on private lands. They happen on federal lands. They happen because of routine leasing programs where it's offered up and auctions through public programs like the Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, through tribal partners. And then it is available privately on private land, but it still has to go through a public body, a regulatory body to get drilling permits to, legally operate in the state and jurisdiction in which it operates. And part of that, you have to meet certain requirements. It depends on which jurisdiction, but generally speaking, across the United States, the threshold to have an oil and gas well to operate one is very low. And that's pretty much the ground zero for why we have the problem we have. Typically you go to a bank to get a loan, you have to meet certain requirements to ensure that the exposure to the bank is minimal. That is not what happens with oil and gas production in the United States. It is pretty much have a pulse, if the regulator rarely ensures that they can legally produce oil and gas, that is usually delegated to an appeals court if they don't have access to it. And then they're supposed to have what is called financial assurance. And financial assurance, shorthand, is in the United States at least, is a insurance policy to protect the state in which it operates, so that if a company does go bankrupt, there is enough money, in the form of a policy for the benefit of the state to plug and abandon the wells. And so how do we arrive at this problem where you have an orphaning of wells, where these companies don't have enough financial collateral to pay for the decommissioning, plug, and abandonment of these wells? How do we get here? Well, part of it is that the instruments themselves are inadequate. They're too little and often too late. And so let me get into the too little part. They are based on amounts that haven't been updated in decades. And this is across the country. There are, Colorado is not the only state facing these very same issues. Texas, Louisiana, New Mexico. This is almost like it's an intentional industry strategy to privatize the benefits and outsource the costs onto the people in which it operates. And it's so the bonding that, tell me if you need me to slow down. I tend to go blah, blah, blah. So an oil and gas company buys a bond typically, where it's just, for this number of wells, I'm going to have this much, 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 to cover them. And that typically you would want one bond for each well, right? To know that, if you have a house, you have one insurance policy for one house. But what the oil and gas industry is able to do in a lot of jurisdiction is buy what are called blanket bonds, where it's, 20 wells, one bond. And so what does that do? It means the unit coverage by well is decreased. So it's like if you have a policy for a house, they're all destroyed, then the amount paid out per house is less. And that's what's happening with oil and gas wells. You have 250,000, 20,000, whatever for a few hundred wells. Well, then you don't have enough money to plug and abandon those wells safely and to the satisfaction of the people who live near them. So that's number one. The tools themselves are inadequate, and it's too little. And yeah, so that's how we got here, is that we're not very discerning on who can operate oil and gas in any given state, and we don't make them put enough money aside to save. But does that mean there isn't money? That's the next thing. Ready to go?
Can I ask you a question real quick about this
Sure.
bonding? And I'm curious if you've seen this in other states too. Because what it seems like is happening in Colorado is that these giant companies will start drilling, and an oil and gas well does most of its production at the beginning of its life, right? And then they sell them off to smaller companies when they're just a trickle of oil, so they're not making a ton of money, and these smaller companies don't have the incentive or money to plug and abandon the wells in the first place. And then it seems like that's the process to becoming
Yes.
an well of the state.
Of course. No, thank you for bringing us back to that point. And that process is called fraudulent conveyance. And so we all know the story, oil and gas, you got a big milkshake, you got a straw. And the goal for these big, large capitalized firms is to produce to their economic limit. And what is the economic limit? So you say production, the bulk of the production, it's a curve, right? We know based on a flow rate how much production is going to come from a particular well. And they know that at, time X, it's going to cost more money to keep the people, to keep the rig, to keep everything out there than what's coming out of the well. And they know at time X, time to spin off that well and sell it to someone else, a bottom feeding company, and who will be less capitalized. And that only happens if a state allows that to happen, right? There's no constitutional right to fraudulently convey a depleted asset to another company. But Colorado currently allows that. They could stop that sale. They could, put together laws that say, nope, you can't sell. And there is something I'm going to introduce to y'all called joint and several liability. It is something that actually exists in the Gulf of Mexico on federal waters, where all producers, regardless of, who produced and for how long, are jointly and severally liable for the liabilities of that well. And so if Chevron sells to, some smaller company and that smaller company goes out of business, they're both on the hook. And that is currently happening actually in the Gulf of Mexico. There's a ginormous bankruptcy happening, about $2 billion of decommissioning liabilities. So everyone pay attention to that one. It's the Fieldwood bankruptcy. But you are absolutely correct. That is a intentional industry practice. They are trying to, push off their debts onto these smaller firms, and these smaller firms, they drain what's left of that milkshake, what's left of that well, with the intention to, kind of bankruptcy for profit, to leave you with the mess and the cost. So they got all that money while you get all the cost. And like I said, that's called fraudulent conveyance. If you sell a company of zero value to another company, a court should usually intervene and say, well, that's illegal, that's fraud. But that for some reason is an intentional, pervasive practice across our country right now.
And the biggest emitters are of methane, it sounded like, are those same companies who, I love your term, the bottom feeder company, because they have taken all these low producing but high greenhouse gas emitting wells. So it looks like these bigger companies are emitting less because they sold off their dirtiest assets.
Sure. So they're moving the debt off their books to overinflate their value, and they're moving the emissions off their books to make it look like they're good climate actors.
Yeah.
And it also begs the question, who are these third-party companies? Who are these bottom feeders that are picking it up? Are they actually a proxy for Chevron? Are they actually a proxy for Occidental? Who are these companies? You got to go through a lot of Bermuda accounts before you actually get to the real owners. And so where's the ball under the cups? That's the question. And, I think that there is a certain, like I was saying earlier when we were talking before, is there's a deference to industry. there's still like this assumption that these are like legitimate businesses and not criminal enterprises, which they are globally. You do not have orphan wells in every state that the industry operates in. You do not have pipelines that are left in place across the globe. You do not have lawsuits about labor practices from Nigeria to, the UK, if this industry were not inherently criminal. And states like to pretend like that they are just a normal business. I'm dropping the truth bombs that are very controversial to some, maybe.
So, so what do we do about this? Like, is
We
it
assert our sovereign authority. We assert that, so Colorado has a lot of choices, and it's like, it depends on who you're looking. Like, are you looking at the Colorado your regulators, or are you looking at the federal government? There's options for everyone. So where do you want to begin?
Let's talk about the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission. Like, they're looking at bonding, like how to ensure that the oil and gas companies can pay for their mess and it's not taxpayers. At least tens of thousands of wells in Colorado that are going to need to be addressed like this. And it's going to cost the state billions of dollars
Sure
if
is.
the oil and gas companies don't pay to clean up their mess. And so
Sure.
we have an opportunity to not fall off that financial cliff right now. But how do we do that?
Well, you make a very good point, and the way you phrase that is that, we tend to look at the royalties and rents and the revenues that are coming from the production, and we only look at one side of the ledger. This is a short-term loan on forever liabilities. And so how do we avoid that at this point? We're starting to see that we ignored the other side. And so what are our options? And as you and I discussed, I think 2 weeks ago, a week ago, there's going to be different assurance tools and policy tools appropriate to the category of wells, right? We talk about orphan wells, but that's not the only risk well. And so we're going to talk about the different categories of wells and what are going to be the tools necessary to fix them. So first and foremost, let's look at our at-risk wells, correct? Right? No, let's go on our just our regular producing wells, right? I'm a good faith oil company. I'm coming in to do business in Colorado. I want to drill a well. I want to get a permit. So what should Colorado do to protect Colorado citizens? Well, we shouldn't just ask for a bond, because this is a separate conversation for another day, but insurance companies can fail, and insurance companies can exit the oil and gas market, which is a real risk considering what's happening in the Gulf of Mexico right now with the Fieldwood case that I mentioned earlier. So what can Colorado have instead? Something called a sinking trust, where, think of your own self. Like, say you have kids, you're saving for college. So what do? You want to retire. What do? You set a little aside each month, right? And you might have a 529 account in Colorado where you're setting aside as trust for the benefit of your child to go to school in Colorado. We can do the same exact things for oil wells, where we establish a trust for the benefit of Colorado. And every month, or in one lump sum, the oil and gas operator can set aside that money for the retirement of that well. Each individual well, no blanket trust, no blanket bonds, just one trust, one well for the benefit of Colorado. And they put that money every month. At the same time, simultaneously, we also make them take out a bond. And it's a full cost bond, as your group advocates. And as that trust fills up, the amount that's needed for that bond will decrease. They're inversely proportional. And so at the end of the day, we have a bankruptcy remote trust that you cannot access if that company is going bankrupt. None of the other creditors can go after it. And it is purely for the benefit of decommissioning, plugging, and abandoning that well. It is real collateral, it is real money, and it is there for Colorado. And at the same time, you're mitigating the risk of an underfunded trust account with a full cost bond. So that's number one for your wells. Do you like that idea? Does that sound good to you?
I love that idea. Sticky trust, that makes so much sense. I mean, there's so many things about oil and gas wells like that are just like common sense things you do with your kids, like save for this thing that is coming up, clean up your own mess. Like, it's just
right.
Yeah, it's just like basic.
Yeah, no,
human.
these are very intuitive. These are very intuitive concepts. I think that can resonate with just any common sense person. This is an industry that doesn't deserve, or, I mean, why does any industry need special treatment when it comes to just taking care of your mess, preparing for the end, which for an oil and gas well is inevitable. You will drain the well, so prepare for it. And in general, like I was saying earlier, the state of Colorado can change its legislation and say joint and several liability. And they can just apply that retroactively and say, oh, well, you're all on the hook. You're all on the hook. We will go after predecessor owners because this was an intentional practice, and we're going to go after everyone. So what does that do? That changes behavior. Companies will no longer spin off lower producing wells to smaller companies to get that debt off the book, because the debt remains. You can't escape it. It's an inescapable obligation, right? And I'm going to introduce a concept that is not mine to present, but I'm going to present it anyway because I think it's genius. It's a colleague of Theron and mine, Reagan Boychuk of Alberta, Canada, has come up with the concept of sticky AROs. Did he already present this to you?
I saw him present this information to the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission.
So he did. So sticky AROs, elegant, beautiful, because right now, in the federal government, there's fighting for between all these companies because the regulator is agnostic and indifferent about how it's settled. They're like joint and several liability. You hand it between yourselves. So what happens is that it goes into a bankruptcy process. Everyone's fighting. Everyone's arguing, and it has to be handled between them. And that's fine. That's less work for the regulator, but it also means that there is a risk. There are wells and there are platforms out in the Gulf of Mexico that should be plugged now, especially in the middle of hurricane season. So that creates real physical risk for the area in which these wells are. And so sticky AROs is just a very common sense thing. However much benefit you yielded from a particular well, that's your proportional cost, right? So if a well went through several owners, okay, you produce this amount of production from a given well, well, that's how much you're going to have to pay proportionally to the other owners, the chain of owners, to plug and abandon. So we have an easy formula where we know you produce 20%, you produce 20%, we're going to go after each of you for that amount. And the state of Colorado should have that data because they keep track of production data for the purposes of severance tax collection. And so they're there. It's low-hanging fruit. It's ready to be deployed. It is both elegant in its simplicity and fairness, and easy to administer if they have kept accurate and good data.
So I just for a little clarity, so sticky AROs, you're looking at the whole life of the well, and you're looking at how much each company benefited from that well, and that's how much each company has to pay to plug and abandon it.
Right.
Is that something that the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission can address, or does that need to be a legislative fix, I wonder?
It might need to be a legislative fix, or so the joint and several liability is something that legislatively will have to happen probably. I don't know, it's a Congress or legislature, the Colorado legislature. They will have to do that at that level. And then the way that they administer it could be just, through rulemaking with the commission. And I think that's very normal, that kind of thing. But there's precedent, that exists on other federal land that exists in California. And so joint and several liability is a pre-existing concept with legal precedent, and it works well. Yeah.
That is a fantastic plan. It's a fantastic long-term plan, but for right now, for our rulemaking, I want to go back to that idea of having a trust. How do you set a trust? I love that, to go along with the bonding.
Sure, and but those are for the wells that have money. I mean, the joint and several liability and AROs, sticky AROs, that's for your risky wells, your already orphaned wells. So we can go after those folks. And then so the trust and bonds things are for the wells that are producing right now. I mean, it would just be set up through the state. It's not, other countries, I forget which country, I'm not sure if it was Nigeria. There are other countries that require trust for oil and gas operations. So it's not something that is out. And it's actually, if you look at the Safe Water Drinking Act, which is a federal legislation that is delegated to states, especially for the what are those wells called? The injection wells. Anything that's endangers water aquifers is subject to that bill. And typically states are delegated authorities, but it is a federal law. they do have rules that talk about trust. And this is something that, yeah, I didn't answer your question. Like the way you do it is just through, I mean, they could just do it through through the commission. They could, issue rulemaking and saying, okay, this is now a requirement of a permit. You have to establish a trust. And there's usually a third party company that maintains the trust. It's an account. It might be invested in a mix of treasury bonds and some kind of index fund. So it grows, and you can't access it unless you are the state itself, and you can't dissolve it unless the state approves. So yeah, it's just an account, just like a 529 account. And it's just like, an account at a bank ready to go and access with its real money.
That makes so much sense. So do we cover all the categories of wells, or was there another?
So there's the existing inventories of public wells. Those are your orphaned wells. Those are your legacy wells. Those are your abandoned wells, but leaking, right? Like a well may have been abandoned 15 years ago, but there may be a leak. I have a colleague in Louisiana who flies over the bayous and like he knows like the API numbers and knows which wells are what. He's like, yeah, this was legally and safely decommissioned 15 years ago, and it's leaking. I can see it. I can see the trail. He is, because guess what? Engineered products have engineered lives. So that is something we also have to confront, is that while there is this mounting financial liability, this mounting debt bomb that's facing states, there is also this forever obligation to maintain these wells, because wells are not plugged and done. An oil and gas well is forever. It is more akin to nuclear waste than the industry would like you to believe or understand. And so when I say inventory of public wells, I also mean a well that is plugged tomorrow, because that will necessarily be a responsibility of the state of Colorado in perpetuity. And so part of the task is ensuring that, we can get from the industry what we can while they still exist. And so another way to do that is to eliminate all of the existing subsidies that exist at the Colorado level, which I am sure there are many. I have not done enough research to confirm that, but my sneaking suspicion is that there are a few. To eliminate those, because you're giving away, money that needs to go towards their forever monitoring and re-abandonment of those wells, because you do need to periodically re-abandon a well. And then so your orphan wells, your legacy wells, your recently abandoned wells, those are all your public. Your at-risk wells, and those are your inactive shut-in, your marginal stripper wells, your insolvent wells, which we can talk about and what to do with that. And that's another complicated little thing we can talk about that may be outside the domain of Colorado. If you want to talk about that. Remember we talked about economic limit. Do you want to do that?
Yeah, we totally can. I do want to confirm what you were saying about all the benefits that oil and gas companies get. There's the ad valorem tax credit, which they get for their rebates from their severance taxes. So we pay them that. Stripper wells have their own special tax credit that they get too. So there's just,
I'm sure,
quite
that's
a few in Colorado ways that we are de-incentivizing plugging and abandoning wells.
No, and that's a really good point, is that you have policies fighting each other right now. You're like, how do we stop the orphan well program while simultaneously encouraging it to continue? And so it's literally you're getting paid to delay plug and abandonment and subsidizing stripper wells, subsidized marginal production. You're just fitting in with their playbook of delay. So you should probably stop that. Yeah, and that happens on a federal level too. There's marginal production federal tax credits as well. And so they're double dipping on that one. They're getting a deduction on their federal and their state liability.
One topic we haven't talked about yet is who plugs and abandons these wells. Keeping a stripper well going, I don't know that takes a lot of employment, right? I'm gonna dovetail for just a second. I have been sitting in different county commissioners are working on local regulations, and there's all these oil and gas workers who come to the commission and they're saying, we're worried about losing our jobs. And we know that, I think 200 oil and gas companies went bankrupt in 2020. Companies are going bankrupt constantly.
Well, they're reorganizing their debt. They're not necessarily going out of business. They're reorganizing their debt, and they're firing their workers, and they're getting golden parachutes. So here's oil and gas companies are not oil and gas workers, right? Like a good day for an oil and gas like executive, maybe a real bad day for an oil and gas worker. And so we have to like distinguish between the two, I think.
Let's
So
let's
sorry.
do
So you
that.
have these, I'm sorry.
I said let's do that.
Let's do that. So these workers are at the meetings, they're worried about their jobs. And did you have a question or you add to that? Because I interrupted you and I apologize.
Oh no, that's totally
Mm.
that's it's all good. I was just thinking like plugging and abandoning wells, that seems like it could create some jobs for all the people who are worried about losing their jobs. I just wanted to talk about, address that a little bit.
Well, it depends on who does it, right? It depends on how it's designed. The devil is in the details, y'all. Um, there are some bills right now that are moving through Congress that would funnel dollars, federal dollars, to state programs like your own, to their own orphan well programs, who have a list of approved contractors. And then that money will go out and yeah, it will go to these oil field service companies and maybe they'll hire a few people and they'll plug a few wells. Um, so let's break that down. Would you say the Colorado oil and gas regulatory program is functioning one that needs to be rewarded with federal dollars?
No.
Why do we have an orphan well
There's
crisis
so
in the
many
first
reasons.
place? Why do we have an orphan well crisis? Who created it? Who co-created it with the industry? State programs. We would not need to address it at a federal level if it weren't for the negligence and the co-production of it with state programs. And this is true of Texas, this is true of Louisiana, this is true of every state regulatory program. They are designed to fail. I'm not saying the people who are in them are bad or they're not doing their job. They are understaffed, they are under-resourced, and the rules legitimately incentivize the orphaning of wells. This is not because of the people or the makeup of like those organizations. It is because it is literally designed to create this crisis. And so now the solution is to just give those programs money to give to the companies so that those companies can take credit for a federal job. That is a federal public job, plugging those wells. And we are allowing Schlumberger, we are allowing Halliburton, we are allowing these companies to take credit for a federal job. Let's cut out the middleman. And that's where I come in. And so like, as we spoke about at the top of this, I have experience with regulation. I was a regulator within a system that was designed to fail. I worked for the Department of the Interior, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So I have nothing but, complete respect and humility towards my fellow bureaucrats in arms who are working within a system that they did not design, that they just inherited. But I think we need to create a new system. And that is where my Abandoned Well Act of 2021, which would create a new executive level agency, the Abandoned Well Administration, comes in. Because the reality is that new oil and gas production does not correlate to new oil and gas jobs. It just does not. And the last 10 years are a real good demonstration of that. We drilled ourselves into an oversupply because of the overturn of the crude oil export ban. We are now allowed to export. And guess what? We went toe to toe with Russia and Saudi Arabia. And then the price collapsed in 2015 and the profit margins, decreased. So how did, these executives, how did these shareholders make up the difference? They fired workers. Production for oil and gas in the United States almost doubled in the last 10 years, while employment in that industry, direct employment, went down by 20%. In the Gulf of Mexico, 67% for exploration and production jobs. They made up the difference by firing workers. And so now we know that production does not equal more jobs. It just does not. And these companies, they know how to do more with less. And they work people to the bone. They're like, you want to make up the 20% that you lost, from because they are just giving, pay cuts across the board. Like if you could do it by overtime, increasing production, unsafe working practices. So the workers are literally subsidizing the profits of these companies. You know what? It's a crappy deal. So the Abandoned Well Administration instead says, why don't we directly employ these workers who are already out? 120,000 workers lost their jobs in 2020 alone. They have the skills, they have the expertise. They live in the very communities where the need is the most. So let's put Coloradans back to work cleaning up Colorado communities. They're there, they have the skills. The accountants, the public relations, the C-suite guys don't have any of the skills that are necessary. We frankly do not need them. But we do need the roustabouts. We need the drilling engineers, the mud engineers. We need those people. We need their expertise. And so we can hire them and employ them with a federal level agency that has field offices across the United States doing this work. And it's not just the oil and gas workers that can be put back to work. Talk to anyone who works in this field. The spreadsheets are a mess. We don't know where all these wells are. Everyone, I'm sure, in Colorado is very familiar with the Firestone story and how tragic that was, where an entire community was built atop a legacy oil field. A house, a gas pocket builds up, explodes, killing 2 men. A woman crushed by her own house. Thankfully, she survived. Her child having to jump out of the second floor window. How many of our communities are built atop these? Let's find out. Let's put people to work. With metal detectors, with drones, with everything, to go out there with the gas cameras that Sharon Wilson from Texas uses. Those things are expensive, but you know what? It's less expensive than paying some C-suite ghoul to steal from us. Let's put people to work. We need people reconciling spreadsheets. We don't know where everything is. There's, in other states, this is more of an issue where there's more federal leasing. But in New Mexico, for instance, there's BLM spreadsheets, there's tribal spreadsheets, there's state spreadsheets, and you don't know where the wells are. We could literally put people to work with a federal jobs guarantee, figuring this out. There is no lack of work to do. There's just a lack of willingness to pay people to do it. So let's do it.
I think that's a fantastic idea. And cutting out the oil and gas companies that started this mess in the first place. Just make it federal. I think that's good.
It's like, let's pay the mob to clean up the neighborhood, to make it safe. It's like, why is the neighborhood unsafe?
Yeah.
Who created this problem?
And that's the legacy of all fossil fuel extraction, right? We have coal mines too in Colorado that have just been abandoned by companies that went bankrupt.
Well, and coal is an example of how this cooperative federalist proposal works. There is a program for legacy coal mines. It is a federal program that sends state monies to states. For one, that program is underfunded for a variety of reasons. Two, states, this is what happens. States are under-resourced. They have balanced budget amendments, and they're limited by what they can do. But if you instead had a federal abandoned mine program, again, where you're putting workers directly employed by the federal government, this is a model can be used for this as well. There's no need not to. And this is something I was thinking about earlier. Government is just a vessel, right? All it does is reflect our values and priorities as a culture and as a society. Government is just what we make it and what we want it to be and how it to serve us. And we can re-envision it as something that serves us.
Yeah, I love that. And going back to the coal thing too, Colorado has a just transition office for workers that only has coal workers and does not include oil and gas workers, which seems crazy to me. They're having this managed decline of coal, but they are trying to ramp up oil and gas production. And that doesn't make any sense for our climate goals or for where we need to be putting our investments.
Well, I think there's a lot of companies and people in denial of its decline. And because they're like, well, there's still many years to make money. We can do this. And that's literally the proposition. They're like, how much can we make? They're like, there's still a need. So let's do what we can while we can. And that's, there's a term for that. It's called the green paradox. We can go into that later. But yeah, because it's got to be a simultaneous build out, right? You recognize there's still a demand. People still drive cars. You still need to plug in your computer into the natural gas or coal plant. There's still a demand. But the thing is that the demand is one that is manufactured. Frankly, if you don't have an option for public transit, you're going to have to drive. That is not a choice you're making. You're not addicted to oil. You have a demand, a need for transportation. You're not addicted to gas or coal. You have a need for light, for cooking your meal, for cleaning your clothes. And the form that takes is generally determined by those in power. And, I live in Vienna, Austria. I do not own a car right now. And I truly don't feel it because I live in a city with one of the best public transit systems in the world. It's almost like, people, it's very controversial, people's opinions on this, but do you like Disney World? Anyone like Disney World? Have you ever been? It's kind of like
Never.
Oh man, it's great. And people really love it because it's so easy. If you stay on site, you got your hotel, you go out, you got your bus or your tram, your monorail, and everything's just there. That is what Vienna is. Vienna is Disney World. You just go out, you get on the streetcar, you go, there's the public pool, it's beautiful. There's 900 playgrounds, like everything like this plugs into wind or into a waste incineration plant that's just up the way. It's almost like completely hydroelectric and wind. It's great. And that is what we like, that there has to be a simultaneous build out. You can't just say we're getting off of oil and gas and not offer anything to help people during that transition. You have to give the oil and gas workers and the coal workers jobs. You have to compensate them. You have to make sure that people are not paying $10 at the pump when they're barely breaking even as it is. You have to provide robust build out of public transportation. You can't just be like, all right, we're going to make you, we're going to work from home or we're going to work less, like offer leisure, like build public pools, do things to make people's lives like beautiful and wonderful. And that's what the Green New Deal is fundamentally about, right? It's the recognition that the transition has to be a yes and proposition, all of it. And, if there's this researcher out of Georgia, Emily Grootman, I think that's how to say her name on my Twitter. She's great. I'll confirm that's her name. But she actually did an analysis of every utility across the United States and looked at when their retirement date, like when is that plant no longer safe to operate and will it need to necessarily retire? And she determined through her analysis that only 15% of the utilities across the United States are at risk of stranding, and that they're all due for retirement and replacement. Like they're ready. Like it's like the pieces are lining up. We don't have to rely upon natural gas. We don't have to rely upon coal for a prolonged period of time. It's ready for an upgrade. So let's do it. Geothermal, solar, wind, we have those resources in abundance. Turns out our electric grid is really shitty and we need to rip it up. Turns out we also need to rip up half our lead pipes feeding water into our houses. Guess we might as well do all of it at once. Oh wait, there's a bunch of pipelines. Let's do it all at once. There's a lot of delayed maintenance, so let's do that and put the high-speed rail. We can do these things. Let's do them.
Yes. I love that.
Let's do them.
Yeah,
let's do them.
Let's do that.
And I live in the future. I live in the GD future. Like I can go to a town of like less than 2,000 people, Frankenfels, where our babysitter's from, and there's high-speed rail to there. High-speed rail. And I'm like, oh, what's that? And she's like, oh, that's our public pool. Beautiful, beautiful public pool. Like for a small town, you can get there by high-speed rail. Public pool costs $3 to get in. It's like, why are we settling for nothing when there are like options? Like we don't have to live the way we live. We can live beautifully. We can.
Amazing. That sounds lovely.
And we just gotta like expand our horizons and plug our wells.
Back to plugging wells. Is there anything that we missed in our conversation where about like Colorado plugging wells? How do we pay for it? We know, just to recap, we know that this is a manufactured problem, that oil and gas companies kind of wrote the rules. Big companies sold less producing wells to little companies, and they are just kind of becoming wards of the state. And slowly there's this process that we talked about. We talked about getting a trust going and also bonding for each individual well. Is there anything that we missed?
Well, repeal the incentives that currently subsidize and encourage this process. One thing we didn't talk about that would be, I feel, a more appropriate task for the Abandoned Well Administration, but is something that is available to the commission, is, companies know when to sell those wells. How do they know that? Economic limit, right? They know at what point, they cannot break even, that they need to sell it. That is a way for Colorado to evaluate and determine risk. They can look at each well and say, okay, are you at your economic limit? Well, you're an insolvent well. And if you're not bonded appropriately, you were committing theft for the people of Colorado, because this well should be able to fund its own decommissioning. The production coming out of it should be able to fund its own plugging and abandonment. And if it is beyond the economic limit and that company has sold it to another company, that's fraudulent conveyance, or if it's beyond its economic limit and they are not fully bonded, if they are not, they don't have a trust fund established, that is theft. That money should be going to fund its own plug and abandonment. And so that is a way for the state to evaluate the health of a well, the health of a company, the health of a field, and the health of its program. You can look at every well and determine, oh, guess what? Our entire program's over leveraged. And the state of New Mexico actually did a really good study where they look. I think you probably saw it, where they looked at the actual spread of bonding versus actual cost. What is it? You have to make decisions that are informed. And one thing that I think, one thing we need to talk about is I am for, it's like the industry should shoulder the cost of the industry. And we always try to get away with as few people as possible to monitor these industries. Like how often are those wells being inspected? I saw during one of those commission meetings that they just procured another like one air quality van, like a monitoring van. Why not 20? That's an artificial limit. That's an artificial constraint that is self-imposed. What I say is determine how often should a well be inspected? Probably at least twice a year, for safety, for emissions, and then how many people do you need to actually do that? Do they have enough authority to issue, fines and penalties and, actually like bar them from operating in the state of Colorado if they are habitual offenders? It's like you have to look at the program in whole, not just like orphan wells, because orphan wells don't just magically appear on a spreadsheet one day. They happen as the result of an entire program designed to create them. And the two metrics that you have are these solvent companies, and are they compliant with environmental rules? And to way to determine that is to actually have a staff appropriate to that task. So like how long does it take an individual inspector to inspect a well, to go back to the office to write the report? Okay, takes them 3 days maybe. Well, how many wells can they reasonably see in a year for 3 days? And then you just determine how many wells do you have? How many days does it take? How many people? And that's how many employees you need. You need to staff it to the need.
Yes, and it's definitely not staffed to the need.
Well, it needs to. And that's the thing. It's like, we're not your enemies, Colorado Commission. What's the full name? Sorry, I should know this.
Colorado Oil and Gas Commission, COGCC.
Colorado Oil and Gas Commission. We are not your enemies. We are advocating for a larger, bigger budget for you. We think you should be really staffed. We think you should have the best gear. We think you should have those cool cameras. We think you should have everything you need to do your job and to protect the people. We will advocate for you if you protect us.
That makes great sense. Yeah.
That's their job.
That's their job. Yeah. And they need the tools to be able to do it.
Indeed.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Because right now we have different groups going out and looking at all these wells that are leaking and filing reports. And then it's supposed to be taken care of, and it's not. And they go back and look, and there's more emissions coming off these wells. There's like these chronic offenders, and
we can do it.
Mm-hmm.
We just got to be like, I'm an aggressive optimist.
I love that.
Very
so good. So good.
Because there are people that I know for a fact, there are people within that agency that really care and are trying their hardest. I know this because I was in a similar situation. I know this. And, part of it is, we have to align the mission of the agency with the needs of the population. And a lot of oil and gas programs evolved and were created during a time where they felt like it was the patriotic thing to do to produce domestic oil and gas. And that was the goal. Like, you look at the 1970s and the oil embargo and the crises that were happening at that time. They're like, we have to make sure we have domestic production and keep our nation powered. So they're operating under that framework. And we have to move to a new framework and a new kind of patriotism.
The law did change in Colorado, but it only changed 2 years ago when the law changed from fostering oil and gas production to regulating. So this mindset is still like fairly new. And the law, that same law changed, SB 181. It finally put in the mission of the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission to protect public safety, health, welfare, and the environment. So it's been 2 years that we've had this mission. On the ground, it doesn't feel different, but hopefully and
you have to, like, I think, describe what a fully funded mission looks like, right? It's because the same people are there. There's new people, I'm sure, but for decades, you've had a leadership, probably, I mean, I speak from my own experience working for the feds, who worked under a certain paradigm, and it is hard to change. It always is. And so you have to help them move along, and like, what does that look like and mean for them? And because everyone wants to do what's good, they want to feel like they're contributing, they want to feel like they have like mission that matters. And so we just gotta work together. We'll get there.
All right. That is awesome. Thank you so. Do you have any other thoughts that you want to
Mm-mm.
share? Anything else we missed?
Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you
Yeah,
so much for talking
yeah.
with us. You're a wealth of knowledge, trying to help us understand the problem we're in and the solutions we need to create.
Well, so here's something I want to say too, is
Hmm.
that like Colorado does not exist in isolation.
Hmm.
Reach out to your like I mean, you obviously are, you reaching out to New Mexico. There are other states facing the same exact issue. And that is why I think it must be handled on a federal level. You know,
Hmm.
why, is Colorado adrift facing this financial cliff alone? Why is Texas doing the same? Why is New Mexico? Why is Louisiana? Why are we doing this to each other when we could, work together to face this industry united
Hmm.
and tackle this problem in a uniform way? Because the reality is that methane doesn't stay in Colorado borders. Your water aquifers are not like, contained only to your state boundaries. There is a real case to be made for this to be handled at a national level. And so I think to get that conversation going, like states need to realize that this is not just unique in particular to Colorado. It is something that we're all facing individually. Trust me, I'm on a lot of these phone calls across the country. This is not a unique situation. So forgive me if I have forgotten acronyms and agency names. Yeah, but
Yeah.
there is a way out. There is a way
Mhm.
out. We don't have to accept the status quo. Oil and gas workers do not have to lose their jobs. We need those skills today, right now. We don't have to, deplete and endanger our scant water resources, which are becoming privatized. Like we don't need to do that. That's more valuable. That water is more valuable than that oil, and it
Mhm.
will be.
Mhm.
So let's protect the resources that matter.
Yeah. Yeah, that is one of the things that gets me about drilling all these wells is all that wasted water. I mean, Colorado's in a drought. You don't need to be using all that water to
Yeah.
drill oil wells and then to export the oil. Like we export the vast majority of the oil and gas that we.
The Colorado Commission, Oil and Gas Commission, is allowing that to take place. Your representatives are allowing this to take place. Seize back control.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah,
your resources.
our greenhouse gas roadmap to reducing emissions includes increasing oil and gas production over the next 10 years. It's insane. It's
And
crazy.
that's the thing. Any this is when I mentioned the green paradox, right? So the green paradox it was actually is a term by a German economist, Dr. Hans Werner Senn.
Mhm.
And it's like basically says that like, once the prospect of real legitimate climate action is on the horizon, oil and gas producing nations, petrostates, and like companies are now have this narrow window in which to legally produce oil and gas, right? They're like, okay, we got to produce as much as we can within this narrow window, or we have to get what we can get while we can get it, right? But that pressed fast forward on climate change because they're all trying to do it at once. And that's the thing. It's like every new like amount of like financing that goes to a well has created a whole like chain of incentives. Like the bank, the insurance company, everyone is now in. The pension funds that are invested in, they're like, well, we need a return on that investment, right? And so we're all in this. We need to divest every part of our society from this because we're going like they want to take us down with them. They want to make what they can make, but at what cost?
Mhm.
It's very depressing, but also
It's
very
very sorry, just like mm.
it's very clarifying though. It's very clarifying. We have a narrow window and we have to redraw the lines and we have to reclaim rhetoric.
Mhm.
For too long, the industry has, created the contours of the conversation about jobs, about all of these things. We need to reclaim that and really challenge them on their premises. And it's like, okay, jobs. Okay, we already dismantled that one. They don't create jobs. We're still useful in your life. And you're like, okay, admittedly, there are some uses for plastic. There are some. So why are we burning it up in our cars? right? If we need it for medical devices, it seems like a waste to just burn it up in a car. We need to conserve it. We need to stretch it out, right? That's an argument for conservation. Why are we using it to like burn on my stove where my kid's gonna get asthma? Seems like we should, save it. Like there's like every argument they put forward, we have to just like turn it on its head and be ready to aggressively go after it. And the moment we start conceding, like you we a lot, and I see this with a lot of environmental groups, especially at the national, like federal, like the DC crew, they concede before like the terms have been drawn. But like, what's politically feasible? I'm like, that's not yours to determine. Your job is to go as aggressive and as far as possible. And then, come what may, it's not your job to limit the scope before we've even got out the gates. Sorry, I'm mixing a lot of metaphors and I
No,
apologize.
that, amen. Amen.
Speaking of, I got a sunrise conversation in 20 minutes.
All right. All right.
Let's see how those kids are doing.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Megan. It was amazing to talk to you. Really, really appreciate your time.
Thank
Thank you.
you. It was really good talking to you.
Thank you.